how would you define innovation? Basically, it's just getting shit done.
Hello and welcome to KIIPSODES. I'm Matilda, and today I'm excited to introduce Laudon Williams, a podcast host, speaker, executive advisor, and digital transformation expert who has years of experience in the tech industry implementing new innovation and emerging technology. In this episode, we'll unpack the impact of cloud computing on the legal sector and the wider business environment. Stay tuned for all the answers in this KIIPSODE. So Laudon, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's just dive right in. So you spent a significant time at Amazon Web Services, AWS, where you worked on their cloud adoption framework. Could you tell us a little bit more about this experience and how it shaped your perspective on cloud computing?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's the prior years that shaped my kind of feelings that we needed something called the cloud adoption framework. I used to do a test. I always tell the story when I have a large audience of people, the technology people in particular, where I ask them to raise their hand if they've ever been part of a project that was stopped, stalled, or canceled. And for technology people, this is like a universal shared experience. Everyone has been a part of that project. And then I ask them to keep their hands up and then say, only put your hand down if the reason the project was stopped, stalled, or canceled was because of the technology. And I find that like probably less than 3% of the people in the audience on average will put their hand down. And that's because inherently, not just specific to cloud, but inherent to any technology is this bigger adoption problem that has very little to do with the technology itself, but more to do with all of the things that surround the technology. And so when you get to something that's a big emerging trend or a big emerging technology like cloud is wrought with a lot of challenges for a lot of organizations. The thing I often point out to companies is that for most of them, they're actually adopting the cloud and they're modernizing IT at the same time because they've been able to do, I'll just say it this way, crappy IT for a long time and get away with it because they own their data centers and they own their compute. But when they move to cloud, they can't get away with that if they want real value. So that kind of leads to this idea of, okay, well, now you've got a lot of people needing to make these significant changes in how they use technology, knowing that the technology isn't going to be the big problem. The rest of it's going to be the big problem. And when you looked across the market at the time, there was very, very little out there that addressed this side of the problem. And so when I took over the cloud adoption framework, there were some great ideas there. There was sort of a version 1 that had been put together, but I spent a lot of time building out version 2 to really try to focus specifically on these problems. So it's the first time I've really focused on something from almost a pure non-technical perspective to address what is inherently a technical problem.
Right. Do you mind talking us through that cloud adoption framework a little bit? It seems like there might be a lot of human elements and other elements that we're not really getting at.
Yeah, and that was, I think that's a really important point. And that's because if we think about previous technology changes, most of those are contained in the IT shop. So if I have to, I'm going to use some vernacular here, sorry, but if I'm moving to remote access or VPNs, or I'm doing these sorts of things, these are completely contained within the IT shop, meaning the IT people never had to peek their head above the board and actually talk to anyone outside of IT. When you get to cloud, it's very unique. All of a sudden, you have a challenge where it inherently can change things like how you do accounting, because you're talking about taking what in corp speak is capital expenses, and you're moving it to operational expenses. So that all of a sudden requires you to talk to accountants. It has impacts on potentially your tax structures and those sorts of things, which is not an IT thing. So all of a sudden you have to poke your head up above the clouds and start talking with business people. And so a lot of what we tried to do with the cloud adoption framework was to really point out we had 3 elements that were really important there. One was around the business itself. The second was around people. And then the third was really around governance. And we were looking at those through this lens of not the technology, but in other words, how those processes had to change and adjust given the technology. I'll say one last thing on that, which is what cloud really does for a lot of organizations is it doesn't change what they do. And this is sort of a nuanced, but really, really important distinction. It doesn't change the what. You still do accounting. You still do sales, you still do marketing. Instead, it impacts how. It changes how you do those things, and so that has a lot of far-reaching sort of implications for the business. And so that was a lot of what we tried to do. Now we still had sort of the stakeholder set that we looked at from the technology side, which was platform security and operations. But what was sort of unique to it in the marketplace at the time was this focus on business, people, and governance, which there wasn't a lot out in the market at the time that was really focused on those more businessy, above the technology line elements. And so it was neat being able to do that. It was neat to be able to tackle a problem. And it was neat to be able to put out some of the first real deep thinking about those types of challenges.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I definitely want to get into kind of the how of how cloud computing changes business. But before I do, I just had a quick question. So when you're talking about technologists kind of adopting these new roles of communication and talking to perhaps accountants, could you speak a little bit about the need for cross-sector fluency? Because I think it's something that we at KIIPS try to do a lot of, and I think it's just so important.
Yeah, it's an inherent change in sort of the business model. I think for many years, the image of the nerdy, geeky person, buried in the bowels of a building that sat in front of a computer monitor all day is sort of what IT was. I mean, there's a little truth to that. I mean, that really was what IT was. But businesses, and you've seen this inherent change in how businesses think about technology. They're not looking for technology's sake, as we've seen a lot in the past. They're looking for what's the business value being driven by the technology. And that's where you see these terms come in, like digital innovation, digital technology start to come into play. It's really not a change in the technology per se, but it's a change in how organizations think about it and how they want to see value driven out of the technology from a business lens. In other words, it's not like, I often say, if you go into an executive team and you say, raise your hand if you know where your email is hosted, no executive is going to raise their hand and go, well, it's in the data center at this address, because they don't care. But if you go to them and say, so if I go in and I start telling them about all the wonderful things I'm doing about the technology hosting or the email hosting infrastructure, they inherently don't care. But if I go to them and say, hey, look, we're seeing a dramatic increase in communications and personal productivity because we've deployed this better email solution that includes other features that help facilitate collaboration. They care more about that because the business value is in the increased productivity and the collaboration, not in the "and we did it" in the cloud part. And so that means that people have to start getting really fluent at being able to explain the business value of their technology decisions and of the things that they're doing. And that's not comfortable for most technology people. That's not very comfortable. But as we progress in the world and things change, that starts to become really critical to the conversation.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, the reason that cloud computing is taking off like it is because it really just gets down to the fact that it's a smart business decision. So could you get into a little bit of depth about, how it can increase efficiency and flexibility and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And I think it's probably the aspect of cloud that most people like, but isn't always as clear to a lot of people. So if we think about traditional computer science, you have this interesting problem, which is you have to buy hardware and you have to buy software and you have to buy all of these things. And so you end up with one of two problems. You end up with what we call constraints, which means I don't have enough of it to do all the things I want to do. Or you end up on the other end with something we call stranded capacity. And what stranded capacity means is I overbuy all of this extra stuff that I maybe only need once or twice a year. So I've got way too much technology or I don't quite have enough. And the problem you have is since you have to make that decision as a capital decision, I have to make a decision to go buy things. It becomes a really kind of hard decision to make. So if you take that problem and you make that go away, if you can create a world where you're never constrained by the amount of technology you have and you never over provision, you never have stranded capacity, that's a really, really compelling case for a lot of organizations. And I think the way that we see it manifest the most is in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, because those, when you need to do them, you need all of this huge amount of capacity to do them effectively. But if you do that at a data center, you're buying all of this amount of capacity for these instances where you run these artificial intelligence or machine learning models. And then when you're not running them, you don't necessarily need that capability. So the ability to be what we call elastic, the ability to grow and shrink as you need to, has been one of the big characteristics of cloud computing that's made it really, really compelling. And it's allowed organizations that can't afford certain types of cloud capability or capabilities, let's say, that are now in the cloud. It's made those available to those organizations. So in the sense where we talk about legal as an example, since this is a group that focuses on that, a small law firm certainly could not afford to go out and provision a huge amount of hardware to analyze a bunch of data that they get. But what cloud allows them to do is buy it when they need it, just use it when they need it, and then turn it off or deprovision it when they don't. So it makes those capabilities available to a much broader audience than we've traditionally been able to make them available to.
Yeah, for sure. Just thinking about like the increased flexibility already and kind of cloud storage, there's also an inherent risk to security that can come with that.
There is.
So, right. So how do businesses, when they're adopting cloud computing as a framework, how do they balance those risks, and how do they balance, the cost of perhaps another risk to security with the potential benefits of having all of these amazing things?
It's a really, really important question, because it's a little bit of what I talked about earlier about, you can do crappy IT when it's in your own data center, but when you go to the cloud, if you continue to have bad practices, especially bad security practices, it can lead to more exposure. That doesn't mean that cloud is inherently unsafe. It doesn't mean it's insecure. It means that some of the bad things you do today get more exposed sometimes when you go to the cloud. So you have to be careful about those sorts of things. So for example, what we see a lot in the industry are unsecured access to data stores that show up in the cloud and that get exploited. And if you read the news, you've seen lots of instances where someone found some test container that was tested with some customer data that happened to be available in the cloud, and it wasn't protected correctly. So, people downloaded all of that data and made it available, and that was a problem, right? So there is that challenge. Now, you mentioned something that's really interesting, which is data sovereignty. And how do I as a consumer, or how does as a human control my data that other companies have? And that's where we've seen a lot of protections around privacy in particular come into play around things like GDPR, where we're saying, look, I need to be in control of my data, and they've taken a little bit further with GDPR, and they've said I need to be able to control where my data is stored. If I'm a citizen of Germany, I should have the right to have my data stored in Germany and not have my data stored in the U.S. because I might have, for some reason, lose control of that data in the U.S. and it might get exposed. So I think what you're seeing is not just a security implication here. Although privacy often has security implications, security often has privacy implications. What you're seeing is this sort of intersection of security and privacy starting to become very critical. But the secondary part of that I think is really important, is a more broad, generic problem that isn't inherent per se to cloud computing, but it's inherent to the kind of the world that we live in today. Do I want Facebook to have 100% of my data? If they have 100% of my data, do I want to be able to control it? And do I want them to be able to sell it to anyone advertiser that wants to buy it? Or if they have all my data, do I want them to be able to store all of my data wherever they want to store it? Or do I want better control over it? So while that's cloud-esque, it's sort of a more generalized problem that I like to think of this as something that's a problem that cloud's exposed more versus a problem that's net new. It's just something that we're more aware of now because of the nature of cloud.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the data privacy aspect is definitely such a huge part of this. In terms of how an international company, for instance, balances different data privacy regulations and concerns, do you have any insight on that?
I actually do, interestingly enough. I've gone through a couple of iterations and through the different eras of this over the years. And so it's often a really interesting problem for a lot of organizations, because most that I know have big legal teams who do mostly just this. They spend a large amount of time analyzing public policy and these sorts of things and looking at sort of the intersection points. So in other words, think of it this way. A lot of these stipulate a way that you have to control something. And sometimes some of them tell you the specific way, really detailed way you have to control something. And some of them don't tell you a really specific way you have to control something. even worse, sometimes one tells you a really specific way you have to control something, and another one tells you the same exact thing with a completely different control. And so where you see a lot of the legal pieces come into play, and by the way, not just legal from a pure law perspective, but legal in terms of like lobbying and sort of pushing for policy come into play, is that it could be, and I'm not trying to be poor corporations on this, but I am pointing out that it can be incredibly expensive for a company to have to adhere to conflicting or confusing legal standards across, especially in the international world where you're dealing with standards from a bunch of different countries. And so what organizations like to see is a lot more consistency around that sort of thing, because it becomes really hard. But there's this real field, and I've worked with these types of lawyers for almost my entire career, of people whose entire job it is in life is to watch legislation, watch policy, this sort of stuff. And I've been handed on more than one occasion an enormous Excel spreadsheet with all of them compiled into one spreadsheet, where you go through each line item and say, we've got to do all of these things. And then you see the check boxes that say, if we do 100% of these, we've met the rules for every single, legal jurisdiction we're in, and policy requirement or law that we have to meet. So it can be very complicated. I think I think as we grow, that's going to be a very interesting niche that's going to become even more important in the legal community, because advising clients on how to navigate a very, very complex governance and legal world, policy world, is going to be even more important as we see more. Frankly, we're seeing more fragmentation. We're not seeing less fragmentation. We're seeing more complexity and more fragmentation in that space.
Right. I think there's also a really interesting tension between, data privacy rights for individuals and balancing that aspect of things with also, we're piling so many regulations onto businesses, and is it appropriate for them to kind of be able to meet all of these, in a business sense? Like, can they physically do it? So I think that's a really interesting tension as well.
Yeah, it becomes cost prohibitive. And I think that, again, the decision a lot of organizations have to make is it easier for me to not operate in a country than it is for me to provide services in that country? And so when we talk about things like equality of services and those sorts of things, it starts to become a really interesting problem, because if it becomes so difficult for me to operate in a given country because of rules and regulations, I might just opt to not serve that market because of the cost benefit analysis, right? It just costs me way too much and I don't get enough out of it. And so then you start to see this sort of weird inequality that starts to happen because, everyone else in the world can do this, but I can't. Why can't I be a part of this? And so I think intuitively people understand that you want some consistency, yet at the same time, you see different countries having very different thought processes around this. Some are cultural. Some are the ways that we think about how the culture operates, and they want to see more cultural sensitivity. But some are just, hey, I'm not a part of this block that came up with this policy, so I don't like them. So I'm going to come up with my own policy because I don't want to be, subjugated to these other groups' policies. So you see a lot of that at a global sense, which could be, really hard. And I think the downside to it is what we're talking about. The downside to it is that markets can get people can get shut out of marketplaces and opportunities simply because of complex regulatory environments.
Right. So I think specifically too, you've mentioned a lot that cloud computing has some significant opportunities in the legal industry, with smaller legal firms being able to afford better storage, better access to their data, and also, kind of the whole niche area of data protection and privacy opening up. Do lawyers and firms need to be increasingly tech savvy? Are there a way to develop, these soft tech skills? And how do you think that people looking to enter the industry should go about that?
Yeah, and I think the legal profession in particular, we kind of think a little bit of the legal profession as being full of Luddites. They're not really technology savvy, and I think that that's fair criticism. Oftentimes, I know a lot of the lawyers and a lot of the legal firms I've worked with have not always been the most sophisticated technologically, but you can't escape it anymore. And I'll give you a really simple but maybe even stupid example, which is because we see it come up in court all the time, which is someone at this IP address did this this person is on this IP address, therefore this person must be the person that did something. And understanding from a technology perspective that, everyone sitting at a coffee shop using the same shared Wi-Fi looks to the internet as if it's at the same IP address, yet there could be 20 people in there. And so making the assumption that the one person you suspect of a problem or a crime is the guilty party because they came from that IP address isn't valid, right? It's not something that actually follows logically. And if you don't know that, if you don't understand that, and by the way, we see this all the time. I mean, there are a lot of court cases where people argue over, well, they had this IP address, it must be them, because they don't understand the technology. And while that's a simple example, it just goes to show the shifting nature of the profession. We saw e-discovery come up, which was really just originally around how do I get all of the electronic documents that are available for an organization through discovery that maybe traditionally would have been on paper. But we're seeing way more sophisticated stuff now, and we're seeing opportunities. Think of financial crimes, where financial crimes have been things where I've taken my boxes and boxes and boxes of paper records and sat in a room with 20 people, and we all looked for that one thing. Well, that's electronic now. Imagine if you, as a lawyer, could take a moment, write a quick machine learning model that looks for certain specific anomaly types, and then instead of having to go through it all, you could feed it all in electronically, and instantly it finds the anomalies in mountains and mountains and mountains of data. As a lawyer, that's an enormous benefit to you, right? That you save on time, you save on effort, you get better data, you're not subject to human error, all sorts of things. And so I think what you're going to see, in my opinion, is you're going to see a new breed of lawyer who are going to be raised on these technologies. They're going to understand things like how to apply AI and machine learning to data, because we shed more data now than we've ever shed before in our lives, right?
Absolutely.
And so the ability to comb through that data and find usable pieces of it, or things that support my case, or that potentially even harm my case, being able to find all of those things is going to become just core bread and butter of the industry. And farming it out to the technologists, I think that's a way to do it today. But to be able to argue in court as to why the jury or the judge should believe you is going to require a level of that ability to translate text speak into something that a layperson can understand. So I think it really does create a new class of lawyer who is very different than what we've seen in the past. And I think that those are the ones that are going to be very, very successful in the future, because they're going to be able to use these tools in a way that really help them prove their cases or defend their clients and these sorts of things in ways that people who don't have that skill are simply not going to be able to do. Yeah,
absolutely, Nate. I agree with you. I think that they're very much essential tools for lawyers right now, if not lawyers in 2 or 3 years. So thank you so much, Laudon, for joining us today. It's been absolutely so refreshing to be able to speak with someone that can really explain the scale of cloud computing and how it's going to affect our everyday business environment. If you'd like to hear more from Laudon, you can check out his podcast series, Stuff I Learned the Hard Way. Laudon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you want more bite-sized content like this, please do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and be sure to follow our KIIPS social media for updates on what we're doing. All our links are in the description box below. We would love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments below how you found this episode and what other topics you'd like us to explore. See you on our next episode of KIIPSODES.